This guy is the strongest healer on the entire continent. In the final battle against the Calamity, none of the hunters were strong enough to take down the dragons, but they had Will. And with Will around, nobody died on the battlefield, no matter how bad the injuries were. But that turned out to be a curse. His allies got fed up with not being able to die. Being pulled back from death, patched up from scratch, and thrown back into the war over and over again was worse than just falling in battle. So they turned against the only one keeping them alive. The general drove a sword into Will's shoulder and said, "Now you know what it feels like to suffer." That was the end. With no will to fight, the army fell apart. The dragons didn't let anyone walk away, and Will found out that even the strongest healer in the world doesn't make it out of a dragon's stomach alive. But you think that's it? Will wakes up 5 years in the past with every single memory of the apocalypse still in his head. He knows exactly what's coming, and this time he decided he's not gonna stay in the back just healing people. He's gonna learn how to fight, get into the offensive magic academy, and stop relying on everyone else to protect the people he cares about, until he notices the letter on the table, the enrollment form. If it was there, then it meant he had actually gone back in time. Will opens the door and faces the world outside. Year 416 of the Solsario calendar, 1 week before the enrollment date at Heilig Academy, 5 years ago. He had thought the dragon took his life. He doesn't know what happened, but if his last wish was truly granted, then he knows exactly what he needs to do. He's going to enroll at Schwartz, the offensive magic academy. It was common knowledge that healers couldn't use attack magic. Will intended to shatter that idea once and for all. There would be obstacles, plenty of them, but he carried the memories of his past life and all the healing magic he had mastered in it. If he used everything he had, he could change the future. This time, he would fight with his own hands. Schwartz was the best school in the world for learning battle magic. They said the elite system there could turn any mage into a frontline combatant. Someone he had met in his past life was also a graduate, but the academy's theories were kept under tight wraps. Only students had access. There was probably no precedent for a healer enrolling at Schwartz. The question was how to get around that. In the end, it might come down to money. Because of the school's reputation, nobles invested heavily in it. If only he had managed to bring his fortune from his past life. But no. Either way, the reward he received as a healer was generous. The problem was time. Even if he started working now, he wouldn't earn enough before the enrollment date. A voice calls his name. Will recognizes it immediately. His sister. He had gone back to the past, and she was still alive. She asks if his stomach was hurting. Will shakes his head, saying some dust got in his eye. She laughs and wishes him a good day. Will thinks that, in this life, he can prevent the tragedy that happens to her later. His healing magic would be enough. He can save the people he couldn't save before. He says he found something out. His sister wants to know what's going on. The Magic Academy Alliance was an organization that brought together all the academies in the kingdom and made decisions about magical education. At that time, the president of the alliance also served as the director of Schwartz Academy, but there was a period when he practically vanished from the meetings. At the director's estate that same day, he was standing beside a bed. His granddaughter lay unconscious, drenched in cold sweat. He rests his hand on her face and calls her name, Marie. He says today's healer wasn't good enough either, but that he will find someone capable of curing her. He asks her to hold on a little longer. That was why the president kept disappearing. He was completely consumed with caring for his sick granddaughter. In the previous timeline, the healing magic of the era hadn't been able to save her, and she had died. Then someone comes in through the window and asks if the director would be willing to let him take care of that job. The director recognizes the boy right away. It was Will, the scholarship student from Heilig, whose talent in healing magic was well known within the Alliance, though he hadn't expected him to be the type who climbs in through windows. Will scratches his head and laughs. He thinks his past self would never have done something like that, but losing a life might have made him bolder. Either way, there's no time to waste. Not for him, not for the girl, and he can heal her. The director asks what his intentions are. Will says they can talk about that later, and that first he needs permission to treat his granddaughter. The illness has progressed faster than he expected. The two stare at each other for a few seconds. Then the director gives in and tells Will to show him what he's got. Will sits beside the girl on the bed and looks ahead, a little tense. He thinks the director of an offensive magic academy has exactly the kind of eyes you'd expect, the type that ends your life on the spot if you make one wrong move. Even so, he takes a deep breath, holds her hand, and starts using his healing magic. His mana capacity dropped when he came back to the past, but the formulas he still remembers. The formula to treat Zora's illness wasn't supposed to be discovered for another 2 years, but his current self already knows it. The girl opens her eyes. Will lets out a relieved sigh and says, "Thank God it worked." With a smile, he tells her that her stamina is completely drained and asks her to rest. She turns away, slightly embarrassed, and agrees. The director asks if Marie is really okay. She confirms it and says she can't remember the last time she felt this light. The old man nearly bursts into tears on the spot. He says he understands. He understands completely, and that it's an enormous relief. In another room, the director thanks Will. He says that if there's anything he can do for him, all he has to do is ask. Will thanks him and says the request isn't a hard one. As the director just saw, his healing magic is top tier. There's nothing left for him to learn in that field. That's why he wants to enroll in Schwartz Academy. The director asks if Will really wants to put a talent like his into an offensive magic academy instead of a healing one, and whether he understands what that means. Will confirms it. The director studies the boy's eyes for a moment. Then he says his authority exists for exactly days like this one, and that he'll take care of everything. He shakes Will's hand. In another room, a man remarks that old fox, when you least expect it, goes and does something so reckless. He wonders if Will can even keep up with Schwartz's curriculum, a soft healer like him. On the day of the entrance ceremony, the director gives a speech in front of everyone. Schwartz Academy is a boarding school specializing in offensive magic, with a unique curriculum, vast grounds, numerous training fields, research facilities, and a massive library. It boasts influential alumni and receives direct support from the kingdom. There is no better institution to learn offensive magic. No healer had ever enrolled there. The director is certain that many hardships await Will, but if he studies at this academy, he will be able to become a true mage. Will thinks about his past. Here, in this place, he will change his destiny. After enrollment and classes begin, Will runs into his first obstacle. A professor tells him to start. Will agrees, conjures a fire spell in the palm of his hand and fires, but only smoke comes out. The professor declares it another failure. He says he can't let Will attend class until he can hit a target with basic offensive magic, and tells him to go practice at the training fields behind the school. Will excuses himself and asks if the professor can at least teach him how to do it. There's no way to practice something he doesn't know. The professor replies that teaching a healer is nothing but a waste of time. Will asked if he could at least study theory in the library, but the professor was blunt. There were no books for healers there. That was when a blonde student cast a spell without warning and fired it straight at him. Will hit the ground. The blonde laughed, asking if he couldn't even dodge a basic attack. This was an offensive magic academy. There was no place for weaklings who didn't even know how to protect themselves. In other words, it was his own fault for taking the hit. The professor agreed with the student. He said Will should ask the healer academy to take him back. The blonde, Ulpus, finished with a smile, saying that at least over there, he'd find people kind enough to comfort him. Will got up and looked back with hatred on his face. Later, sitting on a bench outside, Will faced reality. There was no sign of progress in offensive magic. He knew it would be hard. Healing magic and offensive magic draw from completely different sources. Mages convert mana using spell formulas, and the type of mana defines what they can do. Dynamic mana produces fire, explosions, destruction. Healers only possess static mana, but Schwartz had a reputation for forging top-tier battle mages out of almost nothing. There had to be some method here. If he could learn to convert static mana into dynamic, he was confident he could master the rest. The problem was that getting anywhere near the classes wasn't even possible. Professors and students looked down on healers equally. Even so, he couldn't give up. The person he admired had started with little mana and refined everything right there at Schwartz. Coming here hadn't been a mistake. Struggling in the dark wasn't going to get him anywhere either. He didn't have permission to enter the library, but maybe it was worth trying to sneak in. A voice cut through the silence, asking what he was doing outside at that hour. Will apologized automatically, and then recognized the person in front of him. She came closer, looking down, then raised her eyes and met Will's gaze directly. It was Lady Veronica. He felt the weight of that encounter. In his past life, they had fought on the same battlefield. She was a first-class battle mage, and in the final moments, they had been together. Her magic sword could cut through anything in an instant. And now, in this life, he had the chance to meet her again. That was when he noticed. She had her sword in hand. Veronica said she had spotted a suspicious student, and it was only natural to be on guard. She wanted to know what he was up to, whether he was plotting something or just eager to learn. Will assessed the situation in a split second. Veronica was on a completely different level from Ulpus. If she attacked, he was done. He answered that it was just eagerness. She put the sword away. Said that was fine then. Will confirmed her name, and Veronica agreed, but wanted to know if that was how he addressed a professor. Will was surprised. In his past life, the age gap between them hadn't been that wide. Veronica explained that she had skipped grades and become a professor shortly after, starting that very year. Given her talent, it made complete sense. And that was when Will saw the opportunity. He asked if he could attend her classes and how he would go about signing up. Veronica replied that she didn't have her own class yet. She had skipped grades and barely attended regular classes herself. That year, she was only a teaching assistant, assigned to answer students' questions. The idea was that, being close in age, students would feel more comfortable around her. For some reason, though, no one ever asked her anything. Perfect. Will got straight to the point. If a healer wanted to learn offensive magic, what did she think he should do? Veronica said she had noticed something strange in his mana flow, so it was him, the newcomer everyone had been talking about. A healer learning offensive magic was a rare thing, but if there was any method for handling dynamic mana, she could certainly teach it to him. Will was surprised, but Veronica continued without hesitation. Even so, it would be impossible for him to use offensive magic. He had far too much static mana. Even if he managed to forge dynamic mana, it would simply dissolve into the static, and even using an alternative method, the formula wouldn't work. Will asked directly whether there was no method at all for a healer to use offensive magic. Veronica said no. He took in the answer. The plan had fallen apart, but giving up there wasn't an option. If no method existed, he would have to create one himself. He thanked Veronica and said he would think it over more on his own. Veronica said she wasn't done yet. It was true that healers couldn't use offensive magic, but there was a way for a healer to become a battle mage. Will didn't understand what she meant by that. Veronica pointed to the sword at her own waist. Swing it like this, and you can take down an enemy. Then she pointed to the chair beside her, made of wood, built for sitting. But if someone picked it up and threw it at another person, it would knock them down with ease. Nobody thinks of using a chair as a weapon because it was made for something else. How it's used depends on who's holding it, and the same went for her hand. She could give him a light touch. Will was caught off guard. Then Veronica flicked him on the forehead and said she could hurt him that way too. In short, it all came down to application. Anything could become a weapon depending on how it was used. Will got it right away. She was talking about using healing magic to attack. Veronica confirmed it with a nod. He couldn't understand why he'd never thought of that before. He'd never even considered the possibility. Veronica explained that was exactly what defined each person's nature. That's why battle mages had no interest in healing, and healers had no interest in combat. But he was probably different. The simple fact that he'd enrolled in an offensive magic academy already made him an anomaly. And in reality, his mana wasn't that of a pure healer. Will thought that maybe he hadn't noticed because of the regression. Veronica told him to be aware of that, to embrace the aggressive fury inside him. If he did, his healing magic would surely be capable of crushing enemies. The next day, on the training grounds, Will was still thinking about what Veronica had said. Her analogy had been strange, but it was a real eye-opener. He wondered why she hadn't shown any resistance to the idea of a healer using offensive magic, and it was odd that she already had a theory ready for it. The instructor cut through his thoughts. Since the class had an odd number of students, Will would also be taking part in that day's sparring matches. The fact that he couldn't use offensive magic was his problem. Even if he took a one-sided beating, he'd reap what he sowed. And the matchups had already been decided. Will would face Ulpis. It was an obvious setup. Ulpis Omen came from a well-known noble family and was always surrounded by lackeys. But from what Will had observed in class, Ulpis wasn't just a name. He was a genuine battle mage. Ulpis shouted that healing magic didn't work against humiliation, and that Will would be running home crying after taking a beating. Will found his personality irritating in a way he hadn't expected. In the past, he would have ignored it, but this time the guy actually got under his skin. He wanted to test Veronica's theory anyway, and maybe hit back a little. He addressed Ulpis formally and said he wouldn't accept a forfeit. Will replied that he had no intention of giving up, but he had a proposal. If he lost the fight, he would acknowledge that he had no talent for offensive magic and leave Schwartz. The instructor said that was a wise decision. Will continued. But if he won, he wanted permission to attend regular classes. The instructor asked what kind of nonsense that was. Ulpis shouted that a weakling was clinging to an impossible illusion just to face his fear, and that if there was nothing to break, there'd be no fun in it at all. The instructor shut down the discussion. Impossible hypotheticals were a waste of time. Both of them should take their positions. He raised his hand and called for the match to begin. Ulpis focused, summoning several daggers around him. He shouted for Will to behold his blade creation magic. Countless swords conjured from nothing, ready to strike a quitter who couldn't even use basic offensive magic. Will focused right after. He channeled his healing magic, opened his eyes with full concentration, and started dodging the blades from side to side. Ulpis was surprised. Will reflected as he moved. The true essence of his healing magic was the manipulation of life, controlling vital activity and maximizing the body's natural healing power. But healing wasn't the only thing he could control. If he converted that into an offensive form, Ulpis shouted at him to stop acting like he was something special just because he got lucky. Will activated physical reinforcement. He grabbed one of the blades mid-air and, in a single motion, knocked all the others aside. They froze suspended for a moment before dropping to the floor with a dry clatter. That's exactly what I needed. He positioned the dagger in front of him and said he was borrowing it. He was ready to fight. The crowd had no idea what had just happened. Someone asked if that was offensive magic. Will thought no, it was healing magic used offensively. Apparently no one else could tell the difference. Ulpus wasn't having it. He shouted that Will had to be kidding, that he could summon way more blades than that. A battle mage couldn't lose to a healer. Will pressed forward, deflecting every blade that came at him. Ulpus grew even more frustrated. "It's not about quantity," he declared. He was going to make the swords bigger. He wanted to see what Will thought of that. Will blocked with the dagger. Ulpus shouted in disbelief and pushed harder. He added spin to the blades and threw everything he had. Will figured he'd have to push the physical reinforcement up a little. He blocked the strike. Ulpus shouted that it was impossible. "I'll heal myself properly after." Will looked at him. "Forgive me." He moved the dagger. A wall of sand rose between them. Both stepped back, caught off guard. The teacher had stepped in. The sand was his. He said there were still other matches to get through and told them both to stand down. Will looked coldly at Ulpus on the ground and asked if he could join the regular classes from next time. Ulpus gritted his teeth and told him to do whatever he wanted. Will thanked him. As he walked away, he thought about what he had just felt. That was his form of offensive magic, and it had worked better than he expected, since he had beaten a talented battle mage his own age. All thanks to Professor Veronica. There was a path for a healer to become a battle mage. He could become a battle mage. He looked up at the academy's flag. Ulpus muttered to the teacher that what happened was an accident during class and could become a problem. He said he really didn't want to have to report every detail to his father, and that the teacher should understand what that meant. The teacher agreed. They couldn't have a healer acting arrogant around there. In the classroom, Will thought that he could finally attend classes. He was going to learn everything there was to know about offensive magic. The teacher walked in, glanced briefly at Will, and turned back to face the class. He announced that the lesson would be about magical tool creation. They were going to assemble ice bombs. He would hand out the materials and they should follow the instructions while infusing mana. Will recognized the format. At the Healer Academy there was a similar class, but there they only made potions and recovery items. It made sense that here they were making weapons. They probably expected everyone to infuse dynamic mana, but for magical tool creation, the nature of the mana didn't matter as much. Most of it depended on the materials. He should be able to handle this class without any trouble. He started adding the powdered flame tree branch to the ice golem fragment. Then the mana stone began to glow differently. Will threw it away with physical reinforcement. The explosion shook the back of the room. Will lay on the floor, surrounded by ice spikes, staring at the ceiling like an idiot. The professor called him out on the spot. He wanted to know what Will thought he was doing. Will explained that the stone had activated before he even infused it with mana, but the professor wasn't interested in excuses. He was docking points from his grade. Laughter came from the back of the room. Ulpus laughed along with everyone else, staring at Will with that strange expression. Will glared back. In the next class on magical creatures, a salamander stood right in front of him. The professor warned that students with low grades should sit in the front row and pay close attention. Will had barely finished processing how close he was to that thing when the salamander spat fire at him. He blocked it with a pot. The professor asked why he was holding a cauldron. Will said it was necessary. The cauldron was confiscated, so that's how they want to play it, Will thought. They let him sit through classes, but they have no intention of letting him actually learn anything. A girl was watching him from a distance, with a slightly uneasy expression. The harassment didn't stop there. The professor kept calling on Will to answer questions about material he had never seen. Outside the classroom, someone told the instructor that Will had been misbehaving, and he went without dinner because of it. Back in the dorm, Will lay down, staring at the ceiling. The wind was blowing against him at this school, and it was relentless. There was still a mountain of problems ahead, but he was making progress, and he couldn't let this petty harassment get in the way of that. On top of that, he had fought with his own hands for the first time, and won. He really could become a battle mage. He had also gotten a textbook. He needed to go over the day's material. The next day, Will arrived at the classroom and there was no one there. It was time for class, but the professor hadn't shown up. The only other person there was that girl from before. It seemed like the class had moved rooms and no one had bothered to tell them. Will walked over and excused himself. He asked if she thought the classroom had been moved. She said she had been thinking the same thing. Then she added, since she was the only one there with Will, the student, the professor, and everyone else hated, she figured that was exactly it. I think we're on the same side, she said. Hated loners go well together. Will found the line a bit sharp, but her tone was grim enough to feel sincere. Either way, he was glad to make a friend. He said it was nice to meet her. She said the pleasure was hers. Her name was Erica Glenn. Will told her she was his first friend at the academy. Erica replied that in that case it was hard to avoid. After all, he barely attended classes and, on top of everything, he was a healer. Everyone said healers were weaklings. She herself attended every class and was a battle mage, but she didn't have any friends either. Will thought about that. Setting her personality aside, the discrimination against healers ran deep. In his past life, he had been recognized too quickly to ever face that kind of thing. But at an academy that specialized in offensive magic, the prejudice was strong, and studying there meant having to fight against it too. Erica sighed and asked why he had come to Schwartz. Will said that being born a healer was no reason to stay out of the fight. Erica looked surprised. He said he had his reasons and asked why she had come. Erica explained that she came from a small noble family in the countryside. No boys had been born, and her parents were worried about the family line dying out. They figured that if she could make a name for herself as a mage, she might be able to take on the role of family head. Will said he understood. Graduating from Schwartz would certainly make that possible. Erica admitted she had almost no talent for offensive magic. Because of that, she couldn't make friends, classes were painful, and it was just the worst. But now she had made a friend. As long as she had Will, an even bigger failure than herself, she wouldn't feel so insecure about her bad grades. Will said things might not turn out the way she was thinking. Erica asked what he meant. Will answered that first they needed to find the room where class was actually happening. Erica decided to follow him. In the classroom, Will announced they had arrived. The professor responded coldly that they were late. Class had started a long time ago. Will apologized, explaining they hadn't known about the room change. The professor wasn't interested in excuses, and since Will was there, told him to solve the problem on the board. Erica was outraged. They had just arrived. How were they supposed to know? And Will had barely had any classes yet. Will looked at the board. The professor warned that if he got it right, the matter would be dropped, but if he got it wrong, he'd lose points. Ulpus commented that at this rate, Will would fail out in no time. Even so, Will picked up the chalk. He started writing. The class watched in silence, some already expecting him to fail. But Will finished, turned to the professor with the complete magic circle on the board, and asked what he thought. The professor was surprised. It was correct. He told Will to sit down, and Ulpus let out a gasp of shock. Erica couldn't understand how he had done that. Will returned to his seat with a calm smile and kept following the lesson. After class, Erica ran after him wanting to know how he had solved the problem. Will explained that it looked complex, but it was just an application of the examples in the book he had studied ahead of time. Erica asked if he had read that book on his own. Will confirmed he had read it the day before. The Schwartz textbook was flawless. It covered everything from the basics to advanced applications. No fluff, exactly what you'd expect from the best magic academy. Just reading it was enough. On top of that, he had always been good at theory, and the reasoning he carried from his past life helped a lot when it came to understanding offensive magic. He ended up staying up late, but it was fun. Erica's jaw dropped. The material was too dense to absorb without a professor, and she had thought Will was the weakest student in the class. If he was at that level, where did that leave her? She asked him not to leave her behind. Will placed a hand on her shoulder and said it was fine. He'd teach her whatever she didn't understand. They were friends after all. Erica thanked him. Will thought to himself that he hadn't come to Schwartz to make friends, but having Erica around opened up possibilities. So he told her he needed a favor in return. Classes weren't just theory. The next one was general offensive magic, which was exactly why he had failed and been removed from every class before. He could manage now. He had even beaten Ulpus, but general offensive magic was still out of his reach. He had a plan, and he needed her help. He explained the difference. General offensive magic used formulas that had already been analyzed and structured, accessible to anyone who learned them. Unique magic, on the other hand, was created within the user and only worked for that specific person. Schwartz had separate classes for each. For unique magic, there was no single right answer, and there he could get by using his offensive healing magic. But for general offensive magic, without casting the spell, there was no passing grade. The professor confirmed it plainly. Will might have done well on the written portion, but the practical side was a different story. If he didn't cast offensive magic, he'd fail. The task was simple: hit the target with a fireball, the most basic spell of all. Without that, he could forget about advancing or graduating. The professor suspected Will had used healing magic in the mock battle, and the story about movements improving after healing even made some sense, but general offensive magic was something else entirely. Someone as incompetent as him should just leave the class. Then the professor noticed something. Will was smiling, and there was fire in the palm of his hand. Will felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The professor hadn't noticed. The day before, when he was with Erica, Will had asked her to create a fireball using general offensive magic. He stored the spell inside a salamander tail tail and hid the tail in his own hand while healing it so it wouldn't burn. Erica wanted to know if that was even possible for a healer, and just who the hell Will was. A moment before releasing the spell, Will used healing magic to activate the flame charge stored inside the salamander tail. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a fireball had been conjured right there in the palm of his hand. The projectile flew straight and burned the training dummy. Will turned to the professor with a calm smile and asked what he thought. The professor stared for a moment. That was definitely the flame of a standard spell. The boy might have actually learned it. Will passed. He could return to the line. Erica's jaw dropped. Ulpus ground his teeth. Later, in the classroom, Ulpus got straight to the point. What was going on here? The professor said he'd like to know as well. Ulpus wasn't interested in explanations. A healer had dared to challenge him, and he wasn't going to put up with sharing a class with that guy. If he had to, he'd tell his father, and the whole class would be done. The professor tried to reason that it was a bit much. Ulpus cut him off. Use whatever means necessary, but get that guy out of his sight. Ulpus left. The professor stayed alone in the room, thinking. Trying something outside of class was risky. If he got caught, it wouldn't be the same as some spoiled rich kid throwing his weight around. But sometimes you had to take risks to protect your own position. A mere healer acting like he owned the place, and he still didn't even know what the other professors were up to. He wasn't going to let that boy ruin his life. He'd have to deal with him personally. After school, at the training grounds, the professor got straight to it. He figured Will was feeling pretty good about himself, and that wasn't a compliment. He'd missed several classes since enrollment began. How did he plan to make up for that? Will thought about throwing it back in his face that the absences were the professor's own fault, but decided it wasn't worth it. He explained that he'd asked a classmate for the missed material and studied on his own to cover everything. There was no problem. The professor didn't move. In cases of absence, supplementary lessons were mandatory, and the content was decided by the instructor in charge. It would be a simulated battle against him personally. Will took a second to process that. A professor fighting a student. The professor said he'd give him an advantage. Considering the difference in skill, landing just a single hit would be enough to pass. Since he was being so generous, there was no reason to run. What the professor didn't say out loud was what he was thinking. With that magic, the boy's attacks would never get close. All he had to do was beat him until he understood the difference in strength. Then he'd listen to what he had to say. Will agreed. He'd do it. The professor smiled and activated his magic. Will had seen that magic once before. It was the one that lifted the ground. He dodged quickly, but a strike came from above too. He ducked, and the next one came from below again. The professor asked with contempt if running was all he knew how to do. Will straightened up, analyzing the situation. Unlike creation magic, this style manipulated the existing ground itself. That's why it was so fast, and the range of attack angles was enormous. But it wasn't unavoidable. He leaped, dodged the strikes, and pushed forward. The professor activated another magic circle on the ground, raising walls on either side of Will to trap him between them. He smiled. Will used the walls as leverage and jumped over them, closing in with his weapon in hand. But when he got close enough to land a hit, the professor turned to stone. Will pulled back from the spikes. The professor said the boy was weak. He couldn't even break through his absolute form with that level of power. He'd never heard of a healer using healing magic to attack, but it was just a cheap imitation. Wanting to be a battle mage with such pathetic magic was almost laughable. Will responded calmly. Through healing magic, he had studied the human body in depth and learned that humans generally live while unconsciously holding back their own strength. The reason was simple. The body can't withstand its own full power. If someone tried to exert a force beyond that limit, their own body would break. The professor shot back with contempt. Will was just trying to lecture him because he couldn't win against offensive magic. Will calmly replied that either way, even removing the limiter to release more strength, the body would come out damaged. But he was a healer. It didn't matter if his arm broke. The professor was caught off guard. Will stepped closer with a crooked smile, saying he hated pain, but he could just heal himself on the spot. So let them test it right now. He moved with full force. The hit landed clean, and the professor's glasses flew through the air. Will said it wasn't a good idea to decide a student's limits in an arbitrary way. He had learned that when Professor Veronica suggested using healing magic offensively, and there was nothing more foolish than declaring something impossible, he could become much stronger. But before he could finish the sentence, Will turned sharply and dodged a strike coming from the professor. They stood face to face. The professor was holding his own glasses, visibly furious. Will said he figured the professor would approve if he landed just one hit. The professor told him to shut up. There were no witnesses around. Admitting he had taken a punch from a healer was something he couldn't accept. and he launched a volley of stones. Will remarked that releasing the limiter wasn't just for punching. He drove his foot into the ground and shot toward the professor at an absurd speed. The professor barely had time to process it. The stone wall wasn't rising fast enough. He squeezed his eyes shut, then looked to the side, trying to figure out if the movement had stopped, but he couldn't move. The hits kept coming, and time seemed to have slowed down around him. He pleaded mentally for Will to stop. The pain was unbearable, far worse than being hit at normal speed. He couldn't escape, couldn't even scream. He just begged, in silence, for it to end. Then he was thrown back. His body hit the ground hard. Will walked over and said that for him, it had only been an instant. The professor, still on the ground, demanded Will explain what he had done. Will replied that unlike the professor, he could explain it just fine. At the exact moment the punch landed, he had activated sensory enhancement on himself. Originally a healing spell for people with deteriorating vision and hearing. By pushing his reaction speed to an extreme level, his senses became absurdly sharp, making 1 second feel like dozens of separate moments. He had wanted to know how much it hurt to take a hit in that state. Then he asked if he had passed the lesson. The professor said yes. Will added one more thing. He knew it would be hard to get rid of deep-rooted prejudices, but if the professor kept going down that path, he would make sure the man got well acquainted with exactly what kind of pain his own body was capable of feeling. All he wanted was to attend classes without being bothered by other students. Could the professor guarantee that? Later, in the hallways of Schwartz Academy, the professor walked alone, still trying to process what had happened. He had always believed healers were weak, with no combat ability, meant to obey offensive mages, but Will was different. He didn't just have fighting skill, he had real killing intent. Ulpus appeared and asked if the lesson was over, remarking that Will was one step closer to expulsion. The professor told him to shut up, and to stop messing with Will. Thinking of him as a simple healer was a mistake Ulpus couldn't afford to make. Ulpus said that wasn't what he wanted to hear, and reminded him that if he told his father everything, the professor knew what would happen. The professor told him to go ahead and do it. He paused, thought for a second, then added, if Ulpus went to his father over this, there was a good chance it would be him getting expelled, not Will. Instead of the Omen family making their move as expected, it seemed like Will would be the one extending his claws in the future. Ulpus was left alone in the hallway. He slammed his fist against the wall in frustration, cursing the situation that was closing in around him. A few days later in class, Will yawned. Things were pretty peaceful. The professor had apparently talked to Ulpus because he would sometimes glare at Will with resentment, but he never did anything. That let Will focus on his studies, though it wasn't enough. To change humanity's future, he needed to get much stronger. The idea of using healing magic for physical enhancement was solid, but what he was doing was basically just punching and kicking through brute force. Sensory enhancement worked for intimidation, but compared to the versatility of a battle mage, he still had a long way to go. He needed to think of new approaches. He called for Veronica. She said that before anything else, she wanted to tell him something. Will asked what it was. The professor said he had done well. It had become a big topic among the faculty. For a healer, keeping up with classes at Schwartz was quite an achievement, though most of them seemed pretty unhappy about it. Will thought he could have guessed as much. He asked if she was hiding the fact that it was her who had advised him. Veronica said she wasn't hiding it. She simply hadn't had the chance to say anything to the other professors. Will realized she was also something of an outsider among her colleagues. Even so, he said it was a relief. Everything had been thanks to her advice, and he would have felt terrible if his actions had put her in a bad spot. Veronica replied that she didn't mind that, so he didn't need to worry. And besides, she was grateful. As she had said before, because of the nature of healers' spirits, none of them would ever think to put that theory into practice. Then she drew her sword. She said she was curious to see what a combat healer actually looked like. Will asked what she was doing. Veronica replied that she wanted to assess his current state, since he wanted advice on how to get stronger. Will said fighting her was a bit much. She replied that there are no breaks on the battlefield and lunged at him. Will was caught off guard and stepped back, but managed to block the strike with a dagger. Veronica's strength began to overpower him. She kept pressing forward, blow after blow. Even with his reaction, speed amplified by magic, Will could barely keep up with her. Up close, it was clear it wasn't just speed. Her movements were refined, calculated to unleash a relentless barrage. Forcing his body to keep up through physical enhancement alone had its limits. He had one shot, the speed he hadn't shown her yet. He needed to catch Veronica off guard. He focused force into his foot and went for a thrust. Veronica was surprised, but she moved her sword with precision, deflected the strike, dropped low, and cut the blade from his weapon. Will stared at her in surprise as the sword fell to the floor. He let out a slow breath. Veronica sheathed her sword and said she was impressed. She hadn't expected him to force her to use her magic sword. Will said she had barely broken a sweat. She replied that she had assumed he would just be a healer fighting like a battle mage, but he had skills that put him in a different class. Someone genuinely talented. Will thanked her. The professor added that she liked the ambition and that he was right. Pure physical effort wasn't enough. Will said that no matter how much he pushed past his body's limits, there was a ceiling to what he could do. Veronica replied that a sword isn't only for striking. It can thrust. It can be thrown aside. There had to be other ways to use what he had. Will said nothing had worked so far. She continued. He probably lacked real combat experience. He needed the feel of actual battle to give shape to his ideas. She asked if he hadn't noticed something during their fight just now. Will asked if he should keep training with her. Veronica said it wasn't a bad idea, but that as it happened, there would be a training exercise coming up soon. Will thought about it. Something similar had existed in his past life too. The joint training exercise between the three schools, the Offensive Magic Academy Schwartz, the Healing Magic Academy Heilig, and the Sword Academy Silburn. Students from each school would form groups and take on real subjugation missions. He hadn't participated when he was at Heilig, but in this life, he would take down monsters and change the future he knew. It would be his first real hunt. Veronica stared at him without reacting for a moment, then explained, to participate, he needed to prove his skills in the Academy's selection exam. She had heard about a student being called a prodigy among that year's freshmen. Will needed to aim for first place before any of that. Will asked how the exam worked. Veronica explained that the candidates fought each other. Around 100 people signed up every year, and those who showed strength were selected. Will took in the information. Everything came down to combat. He figured there would be few candidates willing to participate on their own, but that proactive attitude must have been part of Schwartz's style. The thought brought memories to the surface. He wondered what his mentor was doing now. Veronica added that either way, the so-called prodigy had already surpassed some of the teachers. Reaching first place wouldn't be easy. Will figured the kid must be better than that professor, so he asked if she hadn't met this student in person. Veronica said there was apparently a teacher involved, so no one came with questions. Will sensed that wasn't the only reason. She told him not to worry. She would help with training too. Will thanked her. The day of the selection exam. Will walked along thinking the day had come in the blink of an eye. He had prepared as much as he could. Now it was time. A voice called his name. Will recognized it quickly. Director Alnaram Goldgran. Alnaram said it had been a while, and that his granddaughter had been doing well since then. Even though Will had saved the girl, the director regretted not being able to see him after that, and he knew adjusting to Schwartz must have been hard. Will replied that he had struggled at first, but was completely fine now. He added that he was aiming for first place in the exam. The director laughed, saying that was impressive. A voice cut through the air behind them. It was a professor, and the tone had nothing friendly about it. He remarked that this was a joke, this guy wanting first place. As the training supervisor, he said he would love to teach punks like him a lesson. Will recognized him immediately. In his past life, he had crossed paths with this man, the Purple Lightning Goat, offensive magic that had earned him heroic feats in the Great War. Personally, Will held no good memories of him. Goat went on. Combat was talent, and training and effort couldn't replace that. Being a healer meant Will had no chance of winning. Will stared at him coldly. Alniram stepped in, saying the exam would begin shortly, and the results would speak for themselves. There was no point in arguing there. Goat agreed in passing, and added that either way, the one who would face Will was Sirius. A young man with long white hair approached. Sirius Bluenote nodded to the director. Will thought, so this was the prodigy, the opponent he needed to defeat to reach first place. The two looked at each other, and there was something lit up in both their eyes. Alniram remarked that hot blood was good, but it was already time. They should head in. Everyone walked toward the arena. The other students buzzed in the stands as the participants lined up in rows. Will noticed Erica among them and asked if she was participating. She replied that if she didn't, they would cut her attendance in some classes. Ulpus fixed Will with a look heavy with anger. Will smiled at Erica, who made it clear she would rather be anywhere else. Alnaram took the floor, saying he was proud to see so many participants once again that year. He asked them to let passion and fighting spirit guide their hearts. He explained that the preliminary round was a survival match. Whoever lasted until the end would advance to the main event. Will ran the numbers in his head. 100 people on a battlefield. A lot of people. Alnaram anticipated the reaction and told them not to worry about the numbers. Then he raised his staff. A massive portal opened beneath everyone's feet. The ground turned into a starry sky. The students looked around, unable to understand what was happening. Alnaram announced that off they went. Will appeared in the middle of a forest. He recognized the place. It must have been the one behind the academy. A voice sounded nearby, asking if he could hear. The teleportation had scattered everyone on their own. They should avoid strong enemies and cooperate with anyone they knew. Starting positions depended on luck. Will muttered that a spell capable of teleporting 100 people at once was just absurd. The director ignored the comment and declared the selection exam had begun. Will jumped immediately, landing on top of a branch. He compressed his presence to a minimum, suppressing his vital signs so he wouldn't be detected. But when he looked back, there were already 3 students fighting each other close by. One of them ordered his golem to advance. A girl ran toward the 2 of them with a magic hammer in hand. A third one, blonde, unleashed a blizzard and froze both of them in place. Will watched everything carefully. It was a good opportunity to study a variety of offensive spells. It would be a waste to stay on the defensive just trying to pass the test. And besides, he wanted to test a few things himself. The golem boy defeated the other 2. He celebrated out loud, saying everyone must have seen how strong his golem was. Will appeared behind him before he finished the sentence. He grabbed his head firmly and activated the consciousness disruption spell. The boy passed out on the spot. Will looked at him for a second. The technique manipulated the flow of life to force the opponent to black out. It required direct contact with the head, so it was hard to use without a clear difference in power, but it neutralized without causing any injury. Professor Veronica would be pleased. He turned and dodged a series of knives that cut through the air toward him, embedding in the ground all around. Will sighed. Ulpus, you never learn. The noble said he didn't know what he was talking about, that he just wanted to pass the exam, and that he was going to use everything he had to do it. The 2 companions behind Ulpus moved in together. Ulpus conjured knives with his magic formulas. The second coated the blades with poison. The third replicated everything with shadows, multiplying the poisoned knives several times over. Ulpus warned that the knives would pierce skin at the slightest touch. In that quantity, it didn't matter how fast Will was. He wouldn't be able to dodge all of them. The blades were launched. Will calculated quickly. He could neutralize the poison with healing magic, but taking scratches from all of that, even with physical enhancement, was going to be a problem. He activated the healing spell in his hand. Then something threw itself in front of him. The golem blocked everything, absorbing the knives like a shield. Ulpus didn't understand. The golem belonged to the boy Will had taken down. Will figured out what had happened. Healing magic normally only works on living beings, but the golem operated through a mechanism powered by the summoner's blood. He couldn't control it with precision, but by injecting life force, he could direct it just enough. The golem advanced on the group. It landed a clean punch on one of the subordinates and sat on top of the other. Ulpus complained that his men had been beaten down so easily. Will was already in front of him. He grabbed his face with one hand. Good night. Ulpus blacked out. In another part of the forest, the golem was facing a water spell. Will watched from a distance, satisfied. Physical enhancement limited him to close-range combat, but the golem covered exactly that weakness, and there was still time left to study the other students' spells. Then a hurricane formed at one corner of the forest. Will frowned. What was that now? The gust came toward them. Will jumped to dodge, and the cyclone swept through. The golem and the students nearby were knocked down all at once. When Will landed, he looked to the side. Someone was approaching. It was Sirius. Exactly as Will had expected. Impressive skill. Someone who wouldn't be easy to beat. Will was still weighing whether it was worth testing that when the director's voice cut through the air. Enough effort. The preliminaries were over, and all 4 had passed. The main event would be the following day, in the arena. For now, they could take care of themselves. The teleport spell would activate in moments. Will watched his rival from a distance. Sirius did the same, holding his gaze without looking away, until he disappeared along with the others. Will couldn't wait for the next day either. Back in his dorm room, he opened his journal and wrote a few things down. What he could do before the main event. What he needed to think about. The night was quiet. Outside, in the hallway, not so much. A few nobles were grumbling among themselves. That guy was way too strong, and he'd even healed everyone who'd been knocked out. Wasn't that enough to make them give up? Ulpus told the 2 of them to shut up. They came from weak families, so they didn't understand. The Omen family's teachings were clear. Healers had no place among real mages. If anyone found out he was being held back by a healer, what would his father say? The other 2 exchanged a look. They said he could do whatever he wanted, but they weren't getting hurt over it anymore. And they walked off down the hallway without looking back. Ulpus stood there, anger simmering. He didn't need magic to get rid of Will. In his room, Will was studying as usual when a knock came at the door. Too late for a normal visit. He felt something was off before he even opened it. It was Ulpus. He wished him a good evening with a smile and asked if Will didn't think the moon looked beautiful tonight. Will got straight to the point. What was he planning? The noble replied that he just wanted a peaceful conversation. He said, with an almost relaxed honesty, that he hated healers, and that he'd already done quite a lot to get Will expelled from the academy. Will figured he'd neutralized most of it. Ulpus said he was tired of going around in circles. The message was simple. Will should leave Schwartz. Will said that at least he respected the honesty, but he wanted to understand why put so much effort into making him the villain. Ulpus shot back that he didn't need a reason to mistreat healers. It was no different in the Omen family. Anyone born a healer was sent to the remote branch. Ulpus's older brother was one of them. Even when people mocked him, the guy just laughed. An offensive mage and a pathetic healer were completely different things. Will said those were deeply rooted teachings for such a prestigious family. Ulpus agreed, without irony. And that was exactly why Will should leave Schwartz. That was no place for healers. Will asked if Ulpus really thought he was just going to say yes. Ulpus said he'd make him say it. There was a family Will would want to protect, wasn't there? The servants outside had already done their research. Will had grown up with his sister in a remote village. He must miss her quite a bit. If Ulpus gave the right instructions, what would happen to her? He left the question hanging. Then he stepped closer and asked if he'd managed to convince Will now. Will said yes. Ulpus told him to go pack his things immediately. That was when he felt his neck being grabbed. Will threw him back and twisted his arm into a position that left no way out. Ulpus begged him to stop. He was going to break his arm. Will said he'd already made his decision. The crack came. Ulpus started breathing in gasps, his voice coming out in fragments. If he showed up with a broken arm like this, the academy wouldn't stay quiet. Neither would Will's father. Will said it was fine and healed the arm. Ulpus realized what had happened and looked up, confused and relieved for a second, until the next crack. Will had broken it again. He said he'd heal it, and break it again, as many times as it took, until Ulpus asked him to stop. Ulpus asked. Will let go of his arm and spoke calmly. Coming after him was one thing that he could handle. But if Ulpus started going after his sister, he would never let it go. So it was better for the noble to beg sincerely from the bottom of his heart, while Will was still only breaking his spirit. Ulpus stayed on the floor, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A demon wearing a healer's face. He never should have gotten involved with that guy. Because what awaits is something worse than death. And so the night passes. The protagonist tells Ulpus not to forget the promise. No laying a hand on him ever again. Will stretches out in his room and thinks that, honestly, that was a little refreshing. But now he's going to sleep until the next day comes. A few hours later, the main event finally begins. Alniram calmly takes everything in from his seat. Bode and Veronica settle in nearby. Will watches the situation and thinks that the four who made it through the preliminaries are going to face each other in one-on-one battles. Even so, he can't believe she actually made it through. He turns around and finds Erica standing right in front of him. The girl explains that she built walls of fire and used that strategy without having to defeat anyone directly. Will thinks back. The offensive mages ran from the start, but she couldn't have survived just doing that. Erica smiles and says that since they're friends, he could go easy on her. Will says no. She fires back that she made it through the preliminaries on her own and is now aiming for a high evaluation. A professor announces the start of the battle. Erica prepares a fire spell and casts it straight at Will. He blocks with his own arms, thinking it was orthodox fire, that kind of flame he can regenerate through easily. He even feels a little sorry for Erica, because he's just going to have to hit her. But then he notices something is off. There was something different about the fire. Erica launches another fireball and warns him it's not over. Will dodges to the side and realizes the flames that hit him before still haven't gone away. That was Erica's unique magic. Fire with an abnormal persistence. The raw power is average, but if he keeps getting hit repeatedly, it'll be dangerous even with healing. When he saw the walls of flame earlier, he thought it was just a property of the salamander tail, but it was Erica's influence. Now he understands how she created barriers so hard to break, and in a way, that reflects her stubborn personality perfectly. The crowd goes wild. Everyone shouts that she's good, and that she's going to take down the healer. Erica wonders for a moment if she can really beat Will, but quickly pushes the thought aside. She made it through the preliminaries too. She tells him it's time to surrender. Will says it's fine and that he was just about to counter. He heals his own hand as he speaks. Erica activates another spell, declaring it's time to make sure. Will breaks into a grin. If the flames won't disappear, he'll use them to attack. Erica watches the flames wrap around his fists. Will moves toward her. The girl holds out her hands and says she surrenders. She drops to her knees. The winner is announced. Will thinks that even after winning, healers still don't get any respect. The crowd shouts at Erica not to give up like that if she still calls herself an offensive mage. Erica looks at the crowd and says they were cheering for her just a moment ago. She's sorry about that. Will helps her up and tells her not to worry. He thinks she fought well. She has a good chance of passing. Her eyes light up, but Bode appears behind her and cuts the moment short. Come to think of it, he says, healers are worthless trash. Surrendering to trash makes her something worse than trash. She clearly failed, so she should get out. Will asks if that way of speaking isn't a little inappropriate for students. Bode replies that he's the battlefield supervisor, and that if the participants show a low level, but he's already walking away as he speaks, leaving the thought unfinished. He tosses over his shoulder that it looks like only one person is going to advance. Sirius appears behind Will and speaks to him. Will wonders when he got there, and thinks this guy also knows how to talk. He wants to know if Sirius thinks the same as Professor Bode. Sirius answers that in the end, strength is everything, and that Professor Bode was right, because he is strong. Will says he understands, but Sirius adds that he doesn't think Will is weak either, so he'd better be right about that. Will watches him with a serious look. Serious blue note. In his past life, Will had heard of an absurdly powerful offensive mage, the same age as him, operating on the northern frontier. The wind he created destroyed everything in its path, reducing it all to nothing, and in the final match between the two of them, Will was the one who won. Will says that judging by Professor Bode's attitude, it seems like he won't be recognized unless he wins. So he's going to win. Sirius says he understands. The professor announces the start of the exam. Sirius focuses all his energy and launches it toward Will. Will dodges by throwing himself to the side, pushes off the ground hard, and charges at his opponent. Sirius stays completely still and blasts him away with a gust of wind. Will puts his hand out in front to protect himself, thinking he understands the pattern, but he can't get close enough. The two of them face each other. Sirius remarks that Will is fast, which is a problem. He prepares another spell and releases another blast of wind. Will realizes that, unlike the tornado, this blast sends everything flying away. If he takes a direct hit, he'll be thrown out of the arena. It's time to use that. He touches the ground. A tree bursts from the ground, growing in seconds into a massive structure right in front of him. Erica's eyes go wide. That was healing magic too? Will had gotten even stronger. Will keeps a smile on his face and asks what Veronica thinks. Veronica looks at the tree and starts to speak, but Will cuts her off. He explains that he channeled life force into the plants and made them grow rapidly. He learned about offensive plant magic at the bookstore and figured he might be able to apply it. With that, he has several tactics depending on the type of plant. Then he starts losing consciousness and falls into Veronica's arms. She asks if he's all right. Will confirms it, wondering if he had drained his mana. The book didn't say it was such a heavy technique. Veronica says exactly what she was thinking. Destroying is easier than healing. Healing magic consumes far more magical power, and recreating something with it is probably more inefficient than using regular offensive magic. Will acknowledges that he needs to choose carefully when to use it. He never had the talent for offensive magic to offset the cost, but he pushed past his own limit. On the other side, Sirius raises his hand and releases wind blasts that split the tree in two. Will analyzes the pattern as he watches. A tornado that hurls enemies away, a blast that explodes the sides, wind blades for large structures. Anyone who gets close gets hit by the tornado. Powerful spells with no openings, exactly what you'd expect from a top candidate. But Will has already decided he's going to get stronger too. He leaps towards Sirius. Sirius says it doesn't matter how many times he tries, he'll never reach him. Will is sent flying again. Even so, a smile spreads across his face. Sirius doesn't understand, and then a tree hits him in the shoulder. Sirius doesn't understand what just happened. Will explains. The tornado protects the surrounding space, but not the underground. The plant sends roots through the soil, and they grow anywhere. Sirius looks ahead, holding his injured shoulder. Will asks if he really cares that much about Professor Bode. The two always seemed completely incompatible. Sirius answers that Bode is strong and teaches him. Will pushes back, saying he wouldn't need that. He comes from a prestigious family. But Sirius explains that in his family, magical ability is everything. Age and gender don't matter. The strongest becomes the leader, and everyone else is a rival in the fight for succession. His father never taught him magic. Will understands. And Sirius adds, that's why he follows the professor. It's the most direct path to getting stronger. Then he asks if they're done because his shoulder is killing him. Everyone is caught off guard by how casually he said it. Will looks up with a smile. Behind Sirius, a wind dragon begins to take shape. Sirius says he'll handle this and launches the dragon toward the protagonist. Will recognizes how serious the attack is. Lately, he's been thinking about this. Offensive mages tend to hold back in training matches. That's exactly why he pushes himself to fight for real. Having talent, a good family, or a hard past doesn't make anyone better. Everyone has something, and that's precisely why he wants to beat Sirius for real right now. Sirius asks what that was about. Will says he was just thinking out loud, but now he's going to use his best seed. Vines shoot up in front of him. Leaves unfold in the same instant. Will summons the Yggdrasil, the world tree, with everything he has. Normally, it would take a long time to grow like this, and forcing that growth drains far more magical power than any other plant. But the more power he puts in, the more power it carries. The tree charges toward the dragon. The dragon splits the tree in two and keeps coming. Sirius sighs. He watches the pieces of the tree fly through the air, then they start to glow in the sunlight. Sirius doesn't understand. How is it still in one piece? Will explains. This plant has an absurd vitality. Even a single branch can keep growing without stopping. While Sirius was generating the dragon, his defense was wide open, and the world tree didn't waste the opening. The Yggdrasil hits Sirius dead on. Sirius crashes to the ground, injured. Will points a blade at him. Sirius says he lost. The announcement rings out. The winner is Will. The crowd buzzes with excitement. The healer beats Sirius in a direct duel. Maybe he really is strong. Sirius stares at the ground and sighs. Will reaches out a hand, saying it was close. Exactly what you'd expect from a prodigy. Sirius replies that it still wasn't good enough. Will doesn't get it. It was a great fight. Before he can say anything else, Bode appears and hits Sirius with a lightning strike. The boy goes down even harder. Bode kicks the tree off him, then pulls him into his arms and tells him he failed and that he'll train him again. The crowd murmurs that he has a really harsh way about him. Bode turns to everyone and says the same goes for any idiot watching. He can't accept a healer finishing in first place. Dead silence. Will questions whether this is going too far. He's the one who won, but that doesn't mean Sirius is weak. It was a good fight, and if they fought again, Bode cuts him off. He says Will shouldn't even bother responding to him. Talking about a good fight, about future potential, that's nonsense. On the battlefield, ability is everything. Whoever loses gets treated like trash and loses their life. Simple as that. Will thinks that Bode is doing this to his own student. Then he speaks. He defeated Sirius and proved his ability. Being a healer doesn't mean being weak. Bode replies that this level of strength. In the past, Bode and his classmates pinned Will against the wall. Will said that healers don't fight, but they can help everyone with their healing magic. It was a division of roles, and without teamwork, humanity would perish. Bode was silent for a moment. Then he spoke. His student stood on the front lines to buy time while the others escaped. But those cowards were taken down by small monsters as they ran. The students who stayed behind and fought with nothing to gain lost their lives, and the healers couldn't even reach the battlefield, let alone save them. For trash like them, that was exactly why Sirius had died. Bode drew back his fist, eyes welling up. Will acknowledged that Bode was right. Being weak means you can't do anything when it counts. But in an era where monsters will only keep getting more dangerous, the strong can't afford to be selfish. Will clenched his fist and said, people like him, who have nothing, need to become strong. Then he asked directly, if he defeated Professor Bode, would he be recognized? Bode broke into a smile. He said that once a match was declared, all the weak should step aside. The narrator noted that Bode couldn't admit out loud that he wanted a real fight, but the young man made it clear that when it came to the selection, the rules would be his. The presenter looked at Will. Will simply nodded. The narrator sighed and announced the special match. Professor Bode versus Will. Bode cracked his knuckles and warned that he was going to prove his opponent's level was truly low. Will knew his magic was nearly at its limit, and that he was facing the strongest opponent yet. There was no way to win normally. He needed to heal himself first. But Bode was already closing in, saying he was far too slow. A purple bolt lit up Will's face and struck him with full force. Bode looked ahead and laid out the 3 reasons his victory was absolute. Distance to suppress the enemy, speed to prevent any reaction, and power to finish it in a single blow. The opponent can't do anything, and the battle ends. Then he remarked, almost bored, that Will couldn't even hear him anymore. Will asked where that finishing blow was. He was still standing. Will knew about Bode's unique lightning magic. To minimize the damage, he needed to redirect the current away from his body's core. No matter how powerful the strike, if the brain burns out, no healing magic can fix it. So he created a blood circuit that conducted the electricity quickly. Taking it in through his arm and dispersing it through his leg reduced the impact. He could handle it. It was time to counter. Bode scoffed with arrogance. He said Will had managed to hold on, but barely, and in terrible shape. Will activated his physical enhancement, but his mana ran out the next instant, and he felt his body lock up. He couldn't channel any strength at all. Bode explained there was an absolute rule. Anyone struck by the purple bolt gets paralyzed and can't move. Will moved anyway, warning that was going to be a problem. Bode kept smiling. He said that, come to think of it, Will had been doing just fine a moment ago. Another bolt hit him. In the stands, Erica clasped her hands together, crying. Will cursed the situation. Bode was genuinely strong. His unique magic had no openings, and all that arrogance made sense now. Even so, Will got back up. He was determined to win. He announced that this was his last seed and his last spell. He activated plant manipulation and shouted for the tree to grow. The aquatic treasure tree sprouted in front of him. Will calculated, it absorbs large amounts of water from the ground. Used as a shield, it would disperse the electricity. Bode demanded to know what that was. Will looked up. just as surprised as the other students. Bode simply split the tree in two. Will admitted he had no way out. Bode walked closer with a mocking smile, asking if that was his last move. Ending with a defensive technique was pathetic. But then he noticed something beside the tree. Mushrooms were starting to sprout all over the split wood. "What is this?" Bode muttered. Will could barely believe it had worked so well. Some plants and mushrooms grow faster after lightning strikes. When a forest burns to ash, they're the first to appear with no competition. That mushroom was one of them, but that wasn't its only trait. Bode stared at the mushrooms with a strange look. A second later, his expression changed. "My body feels weak." That was the opening Will needed. He focused his energy and closed the distance between them at a frightening speed. Bode smiled. He threw a punch loaded with lightning straight at him. Will spat blood and went down. "Idiot," Bode said, not even bothering to look his way. "Obviously, I'm superior in close combat too. My unique magic manipulates electricity. If I reinforce my own body and move at enhanced speed, a paralysis effect is nothing." Will lay on the ground, thinking that even after all of that, he still hadn't managed to win. "So this is your defeat," Bode said, closing in again with his electrified fist raised. A blade appeared pointed at him. Veronica was standing behind Bode, sword in hand, voice steady. "Enough! This has gone too far, Professor Bode." The professor let out a heavy, irritated sigh. "Veronica, you shouldn't interfere. You're a new hire. The match has already been decided," she replied. "Continuing only serves to hurt him. This guy can heal his own wounds. He can keep going." "Can he?" Veronica didn't back down. "If he had magic to spare, sure, but he has no stamina left. He's just wasting my fighting spirit." Veronica released her energy. Bode did the same. The two moved toward each other. "Enough." The voice came from above. Alniram landed between them, hovering for a moment before touching the ground. "The two of you fighting here is the real nonsense," he said, looking directly at Bode. "Stop this." The principal's gaze left no room for argument. Bode looked away. "Fine." Alniram turned to Veronica. "I owe you an apology. I didn't explain the situation properly to you." He cleared his throat and straightened up. With that, the main event of the selection camp is over. Everyone may leave. The students began filing out of the Coliseum. Will tried to heal himself on the spot, but cursed his lack of magic. The recovery was barely moving, and he didn't want to accept that. Before he could push further, Veronica lifted him up in her arms. He froze in surprise. "You did well," she said. "Don't push yourself anymore." Will was speechless for a moment. Then he nodded, turning her words over in his mind as he tried to believe them. It wasn't good enough. The night passed. Will lay awake thinking. That was the ability of a first-class offensive mage. It wasn't just raw power. The level of tactics was completely different, refined in a way he could barely keep up with. And even with people like that, humanity had still fallen. He needed to get stronger. In the morning, he knocked and asked to come in. "Will, finally," Alniram said. "The injuries are fine, as expected. As soon as my power comes back, I heal on my own," Will replied. "Then participating in the training camp won't be an issue. You were the winner of the main event, so you'll be taking part. Besides you, Sirius and Erica also passed." Will frowned. "But Professor Bode said everyone failed, and I didn't win." Alniram gave a half smile. "That happens every year." Alniram explained that it was done on purpose every year. Telling everyone they had failed was a way to create a sense of urgency in the students and push them to their limits. In the end, most of them ended up passing anyway. Will found it strange at first, but it made sense when he thought about it more. In his past life, Bode had been one of the heroes who fought on the front lines until the very end, defending humanity even in a world he disagreed with. That was just who he was, his way of being a good teacher. Alniram went on. Will would be assigned as an offensive mage in a group formed with students from other academies, and the group would be expected to take on monster subjugation requests. It would be the first time since his regression that Will would face real monsters. 5 years after that point, in his past life, monsters had been the direct cause of humanity's destruction. Originally, monster was just a term for any creature with magical power, not necessarily hostile. They sometimes attacked humans, but it was survival instinct, natural competition. From an ecological standpoint, they were neighbors, not always aggressive. But in about 2 years, everything would change with the arrival of the Red Moon. Monsters would become more violent, start banding together across species, and begin killing humans for no reason other than the desire to kill. 2 years after that, the Demon King would descend. Humanity fell at a disadvantage quickly. Nations perished. Offensive mages, the most valuable on the battlefield, died one after another for all kinds of reasons. Knights the same. Even healers, who normally stayed far from the front lines, were swallowed up by the collapse. Will lost his life. Almost no one who fought survived. Within months, humanity would be on the brink of extinction. He couldn't let that happen again. He needed to become stronger than anyone who had existed in his past life, accumulate enough power to hold back mass invasions, and, if possible, find out what had really caused the Red Moon. Alniram watched Will with a half smile. "You've got a lot of determination. The same eyes as the day we met." He said Will would be fine, and that the teachers were careful about the training field for a reason. There was something he wanted to say specifically to him. Will wasn't quite sure what he meant by that. Outside, he found Erica and Veronica waiting. The three of them were talking when Will noticed more people approaching, Sirius and Professor Bode. Will mentioned that he'd heard Bode's strict teaching style came from how much he cared about his students. Bode stepped closer with a stern expression. "I don't know what you're talking about. Weaklings who can't even land a hit on me have no business being arrogant." Will thought the professor hadn't changed one bit. "If you understood that," Bode continued, "then work hard on the battlefield. Thank you for dealing with Sirius." "I'm grateful as well," Sirius replied. Will turned to him and said he was still pretty quiet. Sirius gave a restrained smile. "Thank you. Because of that, I was able to focus completely on training and get even stronger. That's Professor Bode's way of teaching. As long as you survive and manage to get your revenge, it's not a defeat." "That's a good lesson," said Will. "Get stronger." Sirius broke into a real smile and bumped his fist against Will's before heading toward the carriage. Will thought that having more capable offensive mages was always a good thing, and that he would make sure the battles against the monsters went in their favor. Veronica said it was time to go. Will was already on his way. Inside the carriage, Veronica explained the mission. The Dunkel Forest was ahead. This time, the request was to subjugate goblins in the forest. Each group would be made up of 3 students from different academies, Schwartz, Heilig, and Silbern, plus 1 teacher from one of the schools as support. Erica asked if the groups were already set. Veronica confirmed that Erica was in the same group as her. Erica thought that was better than being stuck with strangers, even if Veronica made her a little uneasy. The professor mentioned that Will's group also had something different about it, but that they had already arrived. It was better to go see the Silbern participants who were already on site. Will knew who they were from his past life, but they had never been properly introduced. A girl called his name, ran up to him, and hugged him before he could react. "I've been waiting for the day I could finally meet you." Will turned red on the spot. "Wait a second, I have no idea who you are." The girl stepped back, not looking the least bit offended. "That makes sense. We never properly introduced ourselves after all." She straightened up with a smile. "My name is Marie Goldgran, granddaughter of the director of Schwartz Academy, Alniram Goldgran." Will's jaw dropped. Will stood still for a second, processing. So it was her, the girl he had taken care of. He never imagined they would meet again. He asked how she was doing, and Marie said she was doing great. She apologized for not thanking him properly before, but Will said there was no need. Her grandfather had recommended him to Schwartz in return, so they were even. Marie shook her head. She wanted to repay the favor somehow too. Since she had no talent for magic, she enrolled in Silbern and threw herself into fencing. The result was reaching the top of the academy exams. "Turns out I have a knack for the sword," she said, laughing. Will thought about that. From bedridden to first place in the exams in such a short time, she was absurdly talented. Marie took his hands firmly. "You can count on me, Master Will. That's why we ended up in the same group." Will smiled and said they would give it their best together. And he understood in that moment what the director meant when he said he was counting on him. Marie turned suddenly, saying someone from Heilig had arrived and that they should go greet them. Erica commented that their group seemed well put together, and Veronica agreed. The atmosphere was already good. Marie looked around, searching for the other group members. She asked if Master Ren and Turf had arrived yet. Will recognized the name. The door opened, and a man appeared asking everyone to be patient. They were on their way out. He stopped outside and introduced himself as Master Ren, wanting to confirm whether those were the students joining his group. Will felt something tighten in his chest. It was his mentor. In his past life, this man had been his master and the best healer he had ever known. He celebrated internally at being in the same group. Behind Ren, a scholarly-looking young man appeared, complaining that the professor still hadn't come down properly. Marie identified him as Master Turf and introduced herself. Turf said it was a pleasure, but his eyes went straight to their joined hands. "And you are?" Turf asked in a tone that didn't hide the disdain very well. "Will, from Schwartz." "An offensive mage," Turf muttered. Ren stretched without any ceremony and declared that this was their group. They could do as they pleased. He would be watching. Marie frowned, questioning that attitude. Will thought that was exactly how his mentor had always been. He stepped toward Ren and asked if he could call him mentor. Ren raised an eyebrow, wanting to know why. Will explained that he could use healing magic, but had never had a teacher for it, and he wanted to learn from him. Ren was surprised. An offensive mage who also used healing. He said he thought he had heard something about that, and that the group's formation seemed intentional. When Will asked if that was all right, Ren shrugged. Call me whatever you want. Marie immediately said that if Master Will was calling him that, she would do the same. Turf tried to object, but it was no use. Erica and Veronica exchanged a glance. The group was already way too friendly. Each team received their designated area, with the cabin serving as a base. The goblin territory was a little deeper into the forest. As was customary in combat, healers didn't go to the front line. They would stay at the base. Marie pointed out that Ren was a healer, yet he was going along anyway. Ren replied that he was the supervisor, so it was different. They could do as they pleased. He wouldn't be a burden. Marie said she would help him so he wouldn't have to hold back. Will agreed that meant something. The goblins attacked. Marie swung the massive sword with full force, sweeping enemies in wide arcs. Each strike landed with an absurd impact. When she touched down, there was a pile of goblins collapsed around her. Will looked at her and thought of the girl lying in that bed. How she had gotten here. Marie's fencing was like that. Every hit driven by raw power. Maybe she alone could clear that entire place. There's a big group of them over there, she warned. Ren crossed his arms. Impressive, but full of openings. Great at pushing forward, but when surrounded, she's exposed. Cover her, Will agreed, and thought that he was finally going to fight real monsters. One of the goblins charged straight at Marie. Will thought those goblins were genuinely formidable. That tension in your shoulders, Ren said. Relax. Will was surprised, but he agreed. It was just like before. Ren always noticed too much. So he activated the magic circle, then the physical enhancement right after, and moved in. He leapt between the monsters, cutting with his sword and covering Marie's back without any apparent effort. You can count on me, he said. Marie didn't hesitate to agree. So that's what fighting with healing magic looks like, Ren commented from a distance. Not bad. Will celebrated internally. It worked against monsters, too. The knife Professor Veronica had given him carried a different kind of force than Ulpus's blades. Cleaner, more precise. You spread yourself across explosive power and fencing at the same time, Marie said. It's really impressive. That's enough for today, Ren announced, already walking. Let's move on. Marie mentioned she felt lighter somehow. Will said it was thanks to their mentor. Ren's healing magic had indicators for serious conditions, but his real skill was speed. So casual, so subtle, that no one around him even noticed it had been used. That's why non-healers never understood just how extraordinary it was. Will had asked about it once. I don't do it to show off, Ren had answered. If you're healed, that's all that matters. Will said nothing more, but he thought the world hadn't noticed. The greatest healer in the world was Ren Kaitos. Later at the group's cabin, Ren reviewed the day. Good group. You all did very well today. Everyone came back without injuries, so I didn't do anything, Turf said. Providing healing through meals is also a healer's duty, Ren replied. And you did that well. The taste was thanks to your special sauce. Marie said the professor was truly incredible. He wasn't just a healer. He seemed to have knowledge of the front lines, too. When you treat a lot of injured people in the field, basic knowledge accumulates naturally, Ren said. That's why the professor rarely shows up for regular classes, Turf added. He's always heading out there. Isn't it dangerous? Marie asked. I have confidence in my ability to run, Ren answered. Will kept eating in silence. He thought, he says that, but he can't run without saving people first. Losing his mentor had been a massive blow to humanity, not just because he was an exceptional healer, but because he was the only one who knew what to do in combat. Fate could change for him and for the others, but there was still time before that incident. Will looked down at his bowl and finished his soup. In this life, he wasn't going to let his mentor die. The group kept enjoying the night together. In the forest, the goblins gathered around an unknown figure. It offered them the power of the red moon. The goblins began to grow violent. A giant goblin moved toward the group. The next day, they went back to subduing monsters. They exchanged thoughts on the previous battle, and their teamwork improved noticeably. At the pace they were going, they'd be done the day after. They pressed on. Ren stopped suddenly. Let's head back. Why? Marie frowned. We haven't run into any monsters yet. That's exactly it, the professor said. There's no sign of anything. Goblins have a strong sense of territory. When outsiders get close, they advance, just like they did yesterday. We've walked far enough and found none. What's going on? Will asked. I don't know, but on the battlefield, trust your instincts. We head back for today, and when we get there, we call another group to join us. I trust Professor Veronica's group, Marie said. They have a base near here. Well informed, Ren said. Let's go there. Will hung back as the others moved ahead. That off-pattern behavior from the goblins had a bad smell to it. Marie called out that they were close to the road leading to the neighboring base. Will tried not to think about his past life. He knew he couldn't, but what appeared in front of him wiped out every thought. Erica was there, hands bound with rope, completely unconscious. Marie moved forward without hesitating, saying she was going to save her, but the ground gave way strangely under her feet, a trap. She drew her sword on instinct and drove it into the soil before she could fall all the way down, holding on tight. Even so, she warned the others to watch out. It was a trap. and they had used Erica as bait. "More coming!" Ren shouted. Arrows cut through the air toward the group. Will intercepted every single one with his knife before they could land. The goblins charged right after, red eyes blazing, ready to fight. Marie climbed out of the pit while Will read the situation. They were surrounded by dozens of them. It was too coordinated. The movements reminded him of the red moon, but it wasn't supposed to appear for another 2 years. Will felt his stomach tighten. Was the tragedy already unfolding? Erica groaned and stirred slightly. She was still alive. This wasn't the time to dwell on it, but knowing that was enough to steady Will. "There are a lot of them," Marie said. "At least she's alive." Will touched the ground. "Leave it to me." Roots burst up around the group, forming wooden guardians that blocked the goblins on every side. Will told Marie she didn't need to stay on the front line. With the archers behind the fight, it would be easier to find the openings. She could set herself up properly. Marie planted herself and let everything loose at once, breaking the enemy formation with a heavy strike. "What do you think?" she asked, satisfied. A goblin tried to attack her from behind. Will hit the monster in the neck before it could reach her. "I'll cover the gaps." "Great work, you two," Ren said. "I'll go rescue the young lady." "Go," Will answered, but something was wrong. A bad weight settled in his chest before he even understood why. The red moon's effect made monsters violent. That much he already knew. What he hadn't expected was what started rising from the ground. An ogre. It had been hiding underground, and the red moon was making creatures of different species act together. Will realized he was too far away to help. It was just like his past life. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't protect everyone at the same time. The ogre's fist came down toward Ren. Ren focused his magic and used physical enhancement to dodge the blow at the last second. Will stood still for a moment. His mentor had learned the offensive healing magic he had taught him. The ogre turned and tried another strike. Ren ducked, leaped with everything he had, and landed behind the monster's head. "Good night," he said. Ren hit the ogre with a mental shock. The creature lost consciousness and crashed to the ground with a dull thud, while the mentor landed lightly behind it. Will walked over and commented on the move he'd just seen. Ren replied that a good mentor learns from his student too. Will said that was exactly what he expected from him, and Marie declared it had been incredible. Ren started untying Erica and warned that they needed to get out while they could. Will considered that, with the mentor's strength, they could probably handle everyone there. The wooden golems were still holding the line. Ren told him to stop being an idiot. He had only put the ogre to sleep. He was a healer, and even though it was a monster, he had no intention of hurting the creature. Once the effect wore off, the ogre would be fine. Will said that was exactly the person he knew. They cut through the goblins and ran. After taking down a few pursuers, the monsters seemed to give up the chase. Will said they could catch their breath there. Ren used his healing magic and asked Erica to wake up. She slowly regained consciousness, disoriented, asking where she was. Marie told her she was safe. Will apologized for asking right after she woke up, but he needed to know what had happened and why she had been alone. Erica held her head, trying to gather her thoughts. She remembered that the previous day's subjugation had gone well, but they hadn't been able to eliminate all of them. When the group was regrouping, something went wrong. Professor Veronica had disappeared. Will asked about that, and Erica confirmed it. Veronica had left a note asking them to wait, that she'd be back soon. But Erica got anxious, and in the middle of an argument with the other two, she ended up going after her. Will figured that was exactly what the others must have told her, and she hadn't been able to say no. There was nothing funny about the situation. One wrong move and the girl could have lost her life. None of them were prepared to deal with that difference in class. Erica said that as soon as she entered the forest, she smelled something sweet. The next thing she remembered was now. Ren noted that the goblins had some kind of sleeping drug. The trap, combined with the fact that they were working alongside the ogre, was strange. But there was no time to analyze that now. Their base had to be nearby, and they needed to regroup with the other two. On the way back, Erica asked them to stop. She stood still, staring ahead with a look of shock. The base had been destroyed. Marie said she had thought about this before. Goblins are extremely territorial and normally don't leave their own territory, so farther away should have been safe. But now she wanted to understand the reason behind this. Will reflected that proactive attacks against humans were a trait of monsters during the Red Moon, but there was no way to explain it right now. Ren noted there were no signs of a struggle, which meant the two had fled somewhere. He was going to look for them. Will, Erica, and Marie should join Turf and get out of the forest. The group agreed without question. Ren also warned them not to assume the base was safe and to stay alert. The group ran back. Will asked if Turf was okay. The boy answered that dinner wasn't ready yet. Marie thanked him for being safe and sound, and Turf turned red. Will said he'd explain everything later, but they needed to leave now. Then he turned and noticed something. He slowly closed his fist. The ogre was in front of the house. It had followed them. Erica panicked, asking what they would do. Will said in a low voice that he was just realizing how pathetic he had been up until now. Erica didn't understand what he meant. Will replied that he was going to take that ogre down and that he believed they could win. Against a horde that size, teamwork would be essential. Marie shouldn't push herself like before. She just needed to land the right hits, leaving the front line to the wooden golems. Erica should hold back the goblins ahead with her flames. The girl said, in a bitter tone, that someone like her had been captured so easily. Will said her flames were very useful. Erica was surprised by the compliment and swallowed hard before acting. She unleashed a burst of fire at the goblins. A wall of flames formed in front of them, and the monsters stopped, pulling back in fear of the heat. Erica cheered, relieved. It had worked. But Will noticed something was wrong. The ogre was pushing through the barrier. Unlike the goblins, that monster was on a whole different level. Will ordered a wood golem to move in and shouted for Erica to use her flames. She obeyed. The golem wrapped itself around the ogre and caught fire along with it. The monster let out a cry of pain. Will called for Marie as he moved forward. She understood without needing any further explanation. She used all her strength and hurled the ogre away. The monster slammed into the ground with a crash. Marie said it had been excellent teamwork. Will agreed, but the relief didn't last. The ogre got back up. The gash across its stomach was already closing, flesh regenerating right before their eyes. Marie asked if they should keep attacking until the regeneration stopped. Will said no. There was no guarantee they could take it down that way. They needed the right method. Before he could think any further, Erica warned that something was coming. Will raised his knife and blocked the impact. The ogre was throwing goblins like projectiles. Will knocked down the ones that reached him, muttering that they were pretty inconvenient projectiles. Erica warned that more were coming. Marie deflected a goblin with her sword, saying in a firm tone that she'd return the favor, and hurled the monster right back. Then she said Will seemed to have a plan, so they'd handle the goblins. Will moved forward, saying he was counting on them. The group split up, Erica and the wood golems holding back the goblin horde with area attacks, Marie dealing with the ones the ogre was throwing. Will went straight for the ogre. The monster looked down and swept its claws in a low strike. Will dodged and answered with several quick slashes from his dagger. The ogre grew even more furious, letting out a roar, and the cuts began to close. Will appeared behind the monster. He said they were full of openings, but that was the point. He pressed his hand against the back of the ogre's neck and activated life overload. The monster's heart began to convulse. An agonizing sensation took over its body. The ogre even cried out in fear before exploding from the inside out. Will stepped down from the remains with a smile on his face. It made sense. The ogre's regeneration worked well enough, but life overload had destroyed the body from within. With no body left, there was nothing to regenerate. He said now, only the goblins remained. It didn't take long. Will separated one from the group. The head hit the ground, and then finally, it was all over. Marie declared it was a complete victory and hugged them both. The protagonist agreed, praising the group's coordination. Erica still didn't quite understand how they had pulled it off. Will said it wasn't time to celebrate. The others were still in danger. That was when a gust of wind cut through the forest. The protagonist recognized it immediately. It was Sirius. If they followed that tornado, they could regroup with the other teams. Sirius stood still, motionless after using his power. Will assessed the situation and concluded he was fine. The protagonist agreed, relieved that everyone had come out unharmed. Bode then caught their attention. He wanted to know what that strange group composition was about and where the instructor and the others were. Ren appeared, answering that they were right there. Will ran to the master, saying he had found the two of them. Ren replied that the tornado had helped quite a bit. It drew enough attention to locate them. He said Will had done well using it and that he was glad no one had gotten hurt. Erica laughed. Bode noted that the mood was good, but someone was missing. Will confirmed, Professor Veronica. Bode said he wasn't worried about her, but that they couldn't pull back without at least letting her know. Ren announced he would keep watching the remaining students and asked whether the other professor could handle the group while they split up. The professor said yes. Sirius and Will would head out to look for Veronica. The protagonist tried to extend his auditory perception to track living presences, but he hadn't practiced enough yet to distinguish them with any precision. He would have to do it the old-fashioned way. It didn't take long. He found Veronica, and she was still fine, but something was off. She was clutching a red moon crystal in her hands. Then she looked back. Will tensed. It was the same light as before. The professor tucked the crystal into her pocket and asked what he was doing there. Will denied any suspicion, said he was looking for her, that the monsters had been acting strange, and that the training had apparently come to an end. Veronica said she understood and that they would head back now. Will asked her to wait. He wanted to know what that stone was. The professor replied that it was nothing. He pressed. He wanted to know what she had been doing all that time, leaving the other students behind. He asked her to answer him. Veronica opened her mouth. She said she was sorry, but that she wasn't usually open about her methods, and that he would do well to stay quiet about it. Will sighed, sensing her aura. The professor told him not to worry, that she wasn't going to do anything bad. He couldn't say anything more. He tried to push further, but he didn't have enough power for that, and more than that, He wasn't ready to suspect Professor Veronica. In his past life, she had been his companion, and so the training camp came to an end. That night, Will couldn't sleep. He kept wondering whether Veronica was involved with the Red Moon. In his previous life, she had never been like this, so he watched her from a distance. Noticing she was talking with another professor, he activated his presence concealment and moved closer, carefully. The other professor said he had received a request to leave campus and wanted to know where she was going. Veronica walked away, saying it was personal. Will thought it over. Maybe she was going to do something related to the Red Stone. He had no choice. He had to follow her. Veronica walked through the city. Will followed. He knew he had left without thinking it through. If he was wrong, he was nothing more than a stalker. But he couldn't just ignore that concern. Not when there was a real chance of learning something before the tragedy repeated itself. And if there was any way to clear Veronica's name, he needed to find out. It was the first time Will had returned to that city since his past life. After graduating from the Helig Academy, the spread of monsters had become a serious problem, and he was sent straight to the battlefield, with no time for anything else. At least, that was what he could remember. Veronica stopped at a stall and bought a small bread roll from an old man. Will watched, and something stirred inside him, the memory of eating that together with her. Almost without thinking, he bought one too and took a bite. It was really good. Veronica smiled and said that place was amazing. Will mentioned he was from out of town and had never bought street food like that before. He asked if she did it often because she had grown up in a merchant family. She confirmed it, but explained it was more than that. With everything that could happen, she had made a rule for herself. Whenever she saw a bakery, she went in. It had started on trips with her parents when she was a child, and later, as an adult, leading campaigns on the battlefield, she had met a lot of people. Most of them she never saw a second time, and even when she did run into someone again, that person had changed so much they were almost a stranger. She didn't want to carry regrets, so she had done away with the idea of leaving things for later. Will said that made sense. It was why she got along so well with everyone. Back in the present, he pressed his own hand against his chest. In the end, he had let Veronica die. This time would be different, and for that, he needed to find out the truth with his own eyes. Veronica turned into an alley. Will kept following, keeping his distance. He noticed he was becoming too obvious and reinforced his presence concealment. At the far end of the alley, Veronica stopped in front of someone. The person said they had been waiting for her, apologized for the location, and stated it was an important matter. Then they lowered their hood and said it was time to talk about the item they had agreed on. Veronica took the stone from her pocket and handed it over. The man held it with both hands and froze for a moment, then burst into barely contained excitement. He exclaimed that it was simply extraordinary, that she had a remarkable talent, exactly as he had always believed. With that, the church's wish could finally be fulfilled. They would make the Red Moon draw even closer. Will felt the weight of those words. So that was it. It was all connected. The Red Moon, the stone, the church. But his focus slipped. The presence concealment began to unravel. Veronica noticed immediately and turned with her sword already in hand. Will barely had time to react to the strike. He could only call out her name. Veronica said so he had followed her. She stood facing him, her posture closed off. The man behind her remarked with a tone of calculated disappointment that he had asked her to come alone. He said he was sorry she had broken the agreement, as he had truly believed he would be gaining a new companion for the order. Veronica replied flatly that he should consider it an accident. The man said that was fine. In that case, he would let her handle it, and the order would still welcome her. Will waited tensely for her answer. Veronica refused. She said she was only there to investigate, and that she had no intention whatsoever of sacrificing a student. Will said he was sorry, but he needed to understand what was going on. Veronica sighed and admitted the mistake had been hers. She should have explained things sooner. That day in the forest, she had sensed something strange. What she had found that day was a monster in a berserk state, and near it, a red stone. Veronica described the strange feeling she got when she held it. When she channeled magic into the stone, it let out an intense red light. That was when the man approached, remarking that finding someone with that kind of potential in a place like this must have been the work of a higher order. He wanted to prove the mission had been worth it, but Veronica wanted to know who he was. The man said he would have liked to talk more, but there were rules. If she wanted to understand what the stone was, she would have to accept two conditions. Keep the stone glowing with the light, which would serve as proof of qualification, and not tell anyone, going to the place they would point her to. He said he was sorry to put her through a test like that, but that he truly hoped to see her among them. That was why Veronica had gone there, to investigate. She figured that understanding what was happening was better than letting something bad happen without knowing the cause. Will said the explanation was still incomplete. Veronica agreed and apologized, but Will replied that he was relieved. She clearly wasn't a bad person. The man sighed, saying that her declaration of interest in the order had been a lie, and that it made him sad. He threw the stone away, remarking that it wasn't like him to discard someone with so much talent. Will recognized the stone in the air. It was the same one Veronica had received near the water, but before anyone could react, it started to glow. The monsters around them went into a frenzy at that very moment, and 8 dragons emerged from the water. The man watched with admiration, saying that even among the Order's members, those who could awaken that much power were rare. Those water dragons were exceptionally strong. Veronica counted 8. Will said he could handle half. She turned him down before he even finished the sentence. It wouldn't be necessary. Veronica moved in with her sword magic and cut all 8 heads off at once. Will murmured that it was what he expected from her, but the teacher didn't let her guard down. She kept her eyes on the dragons. The heads hit the ground, and then they moved. Will asked if he was seeing that right. Veronica confirmed it. The dragons were still alive after being decapitated. He wanted to understand. What kind of regeneration was that? Capable of surviving without a head and without any healing magic. Something was wrong there. One of the dragons came straight at Will. He stepped aside and drew his knife, landing a strike on the creature's body. He already knew how tough that hide was. Will grabbed onto the dragon and said he needed to test a theory. He would take that one. Veronica said she understood, but told him not to push himself too hard. Will replied it would be quick, released his body's physical limit, and pushed forward with full force in his legs. He grabbed the dragon's head with both hands and pulled with everything he had. What came out wasn't a head. It was a tentacle. It was a kraken. Veronica understood immediately. It wasn't the head regenerating because it had never been a head to begin with. That was an octodrakon. Soft body, deceptive form. The monster spoke. It said Will had uncovered its true form in an instant, and that was impressive. The Order didn't evaluate combat ability, so it wouldn't be able to eliminate him there. At that point, it would act against their wishes anyway. It introduced itself as Alroot and declared it would bring them both down with its own hands. Will looked at Veronica and asked if she could handle the monster. Her sword magic would probably be more effective against that type of creature than anything he could do. Veronica said she would follow his call, but she couldn't put a student in danger. Will grabbed her hand. He activated physical enhancement and said he'd be back after taking down Alroot. She just needed to stay safe until then. Veronica smiled, calling him a reckless student. Then she turned and said fine, but that he needed to watch out for one thing. That man probably had something extra up his sleeve. Will was surprised. She went on, saying he had already proven it wasn't impossible. He moved forward. Alroot remarked that he was very fast, then touched his own chest, saying he was too. Will lunged with the knife, and the mage blocked with his staff. Will hadn't expected that. Alroot said he seemed talented at everything. The two pulled back, repositioning for the duel. The mage noticed he had taken a cut to the face. It hurt, but he could heal it. Veronica watched from a distance and explained. The red stone emitted a passive flow of mana that resembled offensive magic. In other words, Alroot was a healer who could fight. Will asked how he knew the combat methods for healing magic. Alroot answered that of course he didn't, but watching someone like Will in action, he was able to learn, as if Will himself were his teacher. Will thought that this had once existed as a combat method for healers. He wanted to know how far these people had come. Alroot said that at this point, it was clear Will had been talented from the start, and that he was very envious. He would love to meet the person who had taught him. He asked what Will thought, whether he had any interest in joining the Order. Will said he had to be joking. He would never become one of those pieces of trash, not even if he were reborn. The healing magic in his hands took on a reddish hue. Alroot was surprised. He said that was a shame then. He moved toward Will, declaring he would finish him off right there. Will blocked with the dagger. He thought that Alroot's physical enhancement was strong. The Order, the red stone, healing magic combined with offensive magic, there was a lot he still didn't understand. But he would get every answer from this man, and maybe, somehow, he could prevent the tragedy. He deflected Alroot's staff, spun in the same motion, and kicked the mage away. Alroot steadied himself on his staff and admitted that at this rate, he would actually lose, but he said he had the Order behind him. He activated something, body corruption. One of his eyes turned red like a fox's. His arm began to warp, twisting into a monstrous shape. Alroot said it was absolutely magnificent. Will thought that this was far beyond any normal physical enhancement with healing magic. He wanted to know who Alroot had learned it from. The mage answered that everything came from the Order's teachings. Before that, he had lived a dull life, not thinking about anything. He was a healer hired by magic units, following orders from arrogant people, every day the same as the last. But as a healer, he also knew how to see, and what he saw was a world full of people who didn't deserve to be saved. The Order gave them power and awakening. So Alroot's life had finally begun to shine. Will said he didn't know what Alroot had realized, but what he was doing was wrong. If he kept going like this, a lot of people would lose their lives. Alroot struck his own deformed muscle and answered that everything was fine. The order said it was supposed to be this way. Then he hurled Will hard across the alley. Will hit the wall and coughed up blood. Alroot walked toward him, declaring that justice always wins. Will thought about that. Because of an empty shell like him, his younger brother, teacher Veronica, and so many others had lost their lives. Alroot stopped, surprised. He wanted to know how Will was still standing with that much damage built up, but there was something different about him. Will started healing his own arm. The wounds closed almost instantly. Alroot couldn't believe it. Every wound had healed in seconds. What kind of recovery was that? Will said he would never forgive Alroot, and that he was going to make him suffer something worse than death. Alroot charged forward, saying he would take Will's life too fast for him to have any chance to heal. Will moved at the same time, hitting the monstrous arm with everything he had. Alroot was pushed back by the impact. Will told him not to start screaming over that, because he wasn't even close to done. Alroot had barely processed the thought that Will was moving too fast when an uppercut landed clean on his jaw. He flew back, got lodged in the ceiling of the alley, and dropped to the ground completely knocked out. Will looked at the motionless body and said Alroot was already out cold. He'd deal with him later. Then he turned to teacher Veronica, who was still facing the Kraken. She focused and delivered a massive slash with her sword, the flash magic. The creature was split in two, each piece falling to the ground like slices of sushi. Veronica noted that Will seemed to have finished too. The monster's regeneration was strong, so it had taken some time. Will agreed that the Kraken had been a tough opponent, but he turned right after, slammed Alroot's face hard, and drove his body into the wall. He pressed the knife against the mage's face and said he was going to answer some questions. Alroot replied that it would be that way then, and asked Will not to make such a scary face. Will said that was up to him. He had a lot to ask. He wanted to know what the cult was and what its goal was. Alroot said a believer never leaks information to outsiders. Then he pressed his own dagger against his neck and declared that he would devote his life to the cult. He wished long life to the cult and took his own life. Will froze. Alroot wept, saying he had sacrificed himself to protect the cult's secrets. He was a perfect believer. With that, his soul would be guided to the world of desires of Lord Claudios. But then Alroot's mind began to clear. He realized the wound had disappeared. Alroot murmured, confused. He was sure he had hit his own trachea. The pain of the cold blade had been real. Will said he was surprised when Alroot did that. He had underestimated his faith, but he was able to heal him. Alroot said it was impossible. He had died. Will replied that he could heal even so. Alroot insisted that was impossible for any normal healer. Will said he wasn't normal, and that in the future he would be the best healer in the world. Then he let the threat hang in the air. If he could heal someone on the brink of death, he could also hurt someone to that point and heal them again as many times as needed. Alroot understood what that meant and was terrified. Will asked if he was ready to talk. Alroot thought he had no choice, but before he could open his mouth, something took over his mind. A voice ordered him to die. Panic spread across Alroot's face. He collapsed to the ground, crying with no control over his own body. Will stepped back, shocked. The man was dying on his own. Veronica shouted for him to get away. Something was wrong. Will obeyed. Alroot's body began to dissolve into smoke. The two covered their faces with their arms as the remains rotted on the ground. Will rushed to what was left and tried to heal him, telling him to hold on, but it was useless. Alroot's life force had been wiped out in an instant, some kind of powerful curse, too strong to be reversed. Will muttered, wondering who was behind that cult. Veronica asked if he was okay. Will confirmed he was, but grumbled that he had lost the only chance to get information, and that it was his fault. Veronica said it was enough that the student was alive, and that it was time to head back to the academy. On the way back, Will mentioned that the redstone had been destroyed out of nowhere. Veronica said the cult and the redstone were far too dangerous. Just knowing they existed was unsettling, and they needed to be careful. Will agreed. He thought that, compared to his previous life, he was making progress, but he wondered if it would be enough. Veronica said that in the end she was glad he had come out into the field too. She had pushed the director for that, and it was because of Will that she had noticed something. Will understood. Veronica had only noticed his existence in this life, so he took the chance to ask why she kept using mana to attack, being a healer. Veronica said she came from a merchant family and had always had plenty of chances to interact with healers and attack mages. Maybe that was why. Will said that if that alone were enough, mana research would already be far more advanced. Veronica admitted she couldn't explain it properly. It was like someone had told her something when she was young, a vague feeling, hard to pin down. Will wondered if that person might have some connection to the cult. Veronica changed the subject and asked if he wanted to eat some bread. Will was speechless for a moment, then agreed. Even with so many mysteries still open, Will had managed to find a clue to steer away from the destruction he knew. Of course, he was also punished for leaving without permission. Elsewhere, in a noble mansion, a man died quickly. There was a vampire bite mark on his neck. A voice asked if he had died and said it was now coming for her. The woman sighed. She said she would do it if it was an order from the cult.